Good evening and welcome to Pull. Tonight, with violence and corruption a part of daily life in Afghanistan, I'll talk with three prominent experts on the importance of the rule of law. J. Alexander Thier is the Senior Advisor in the Rule of Law Program at the United States Institute of Peace, the Director of the Future of Afghanistan Project, and a member of the Afghanistan Study Group. Mr. Thier is responsible for several rule of law programs in Afghanistan, including a project on establishing relationships between Afghanistan's formal and informal justice system. Joan Winship is the Executive Director of the International Association of Women Judges, which works to advance women's rights, their access to the courts, and develop judicial leadership around the world. Mrs. Winship has traveled to Kabul as a representative of the association. And Tim Nusraty is a Senior Advisor on Afghan Justice Reform in the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan at the United States Department of State. I wanted to start with the broader issue. There was recently a survey that stated that the Afghan people have less confidence in their government now than they did 2 years ago. How do you think this lack of trust affects the ability to carry out rule of law programs?
I think that overall, this is really the central issue of getting the Afghan people back on board with the Afghan government. Ultimately, if the Afghan people don't trust their own government and the international community, then they're not going to make the sacrifices necessary to make Afghanistan a stable, peaceful, and prosperous place in the future. And I think that for most Afghans, the question of justice, access to the rule of law, and the end of impunity are fundamental to their ability to believe again and have confidence in the government.
I certainly agree with what Alex said. Afghanistan, there is a culture of impunity that exists right now. Corruption is pervasive. It runs across all sectors. It is a significant problem. In a recent survey, 83% of Afghans said that corruption is a greater problem than insecurity in their view. So it certainly is a very, very tremendous problem in Afghanistan.
You know, General Dostum recently, Turkey chartered a plane for him to leave Afghanistan, and he had been charged with crimes against a political rival. And some Afghans would say that, you know, here's a government official who's above the law, while there are Afghans who are detained at Bagram without a fair trial.
I think that there's no question that people who have engaged in abuses, not only in the past, I mean, we've had now a 20 to 30-year history of human rights abuses by people who are powerful inside and outside of government against the population. And I believe that if the government is going to be credible in the eyes of the people, if it's going to be trusted, and if it's going to deliver on its promises by actually being an effective and functioning entity, then it needs to, at a minimum, exclude those who are abusing the population and have done so in the past. I think that the international community needs to take very seriously the question of how to deal with people who have committed crimes, not only because it's important to deal with the question of justice, but also because the government today, if it's going to function, if it's going to be non-corrupt, if it's going to serve the needs of the people, needs to be filled or populated with people who also believe in those ideals. And people who have abused in the past, who've stolen land, who have conducted extrajudicial killings and things like that, I think simply don't represent a group of people who are likely to build a strong and competent Afghan government.
Joan, I wanted to pick up with you. You've traveled to Kabul and you've met women judges.
Yes.
What were your impressions of the challenges they face and maybe some of their views on this issue?
Well, I think they're facing the same kinds of concerns. Many of the women judges are extremely dedicated to see that the rule of law be applied, that equal justice be applied throughout the courts. They face the same kinds of challenges that male judges do too. the corruption. Tim mentioned the corruption. Corruption, they're very aware of corruption. They're aware of the fact that there are people, in fact, who are on the courts right now who may not be among the most qualified. And so one of the things is how to get new people trained into the constitutional law, and how to get them to be more effective as judges. Among the things I think that they feel is that one of the things that judges face is very low salaries. And so how do you deal with corruption when in fact they are facing the challenges of salary levels to begin with? That's another issue.
Joan raises a very good point. In Afghanistan, the salary for a judge or a prosecutor is less than $100 a month. Typically, it's between $70 to $80. This is in a country where the living wage is between $250 to $300 a month. They need to support their families. They have children and wives and husbands. So clearly, raising salaries has been a priority for the U.S. government. At the Rome Conference on Rule of Law in Afghanistan last year, the United States specifically pledged $10 million for salary supports for judges, prosecutors, and attorneys in Afghanistan. So it is a very critical element.
Do you think, though, that the Karzai government and the administration is doing enough? Let's assume this money gets into the budget. Besides the salaries, are they doing enough to combat corruption?
This was a major topic at the June conference in Paris, where donors came in to pledge additional funds, hundreds or billions of dollars for Afghanistan, and donors pressured the Afghans to say, if we are providing you these sums of money, you need to give us assurances that the rule of law will be upheld, that there will be transparency and accountability mechanisms set up. And the Afghan government has taken some initial positive steps to put in place mechanisms that can tackle corruption.
I want to say something, I think, somewhat in defense of some of the professionals working in the Afghan justice sector, because we talk about these problems of corruption, which are true. But at the same time, there are a lot of good people, a lot of good Afghans who are working for the government as judges, as prosecutors, but they face really two fundamental problems. First, the overall environment that they work in is not conducive because it's not an environment that supports the rule of law. So they get pressure from local warlords and people who are influential to make certain decisions. They have low salaries, as we talked about. They get pressure from the executive as well. The other problem is that none of these people has worked in a functioning environment for at least the last 30 years. If we had all grown up working in dysfunctional environments, then we wouldn't be very good at doing our jobs either. And so it's fundamental that not only that we tackle corruption as a problem, but that we create a positive environment for Afghan professionals to work in, which is obviously one that includes women, but that includes protections for those people, that includes a living wage, and that creates an environment where they can learn how to do their jobs effectively. And that requires us to prioritize, because the idea that we're going to build a justice system everywhere in Afghanistan all at once is ridiculous.
I think the point is well taken, and not only the internal or even the judges themselves, but you mentioned the work environment that they face. I have visited the narcotics court, which of course is a modern court that has good facilities, electricity, and looks like a functioning court that we in the United States would consider. But I've also visited juvenile court and family court, and the conditions under which the judges must work is extremely poor. They don't have, very often not electricity. The same room is the office and the courtroom, and everyone must sit in a situation that is even smaller than what we are sitting here. So just the conditions under which I think are some of the things, and it's a challenge to address all of those things all at once.
I'm going to have to take a short break and look ahead to the next presidential election in Afghanistan and more about women's rights when we return. Back with Alex Thier, Joan Winship, and Tim Nusraty. I want to pick up on the Afghan elections. We just had our elections in the U.S. here, and there will be presidential elections next year in Afghanistan. Of course, rule of law is very important to holding free and fair elections. What are your thoughts on the opportunities to hold such a free and fair election in Afghanistan?
Well, I'm quite concerned about the elections for two reasons. The first is that we are coming up on a period of possible political turmoil in Afghanistan because the elections have not been prepared to happen according to the constitutional timeline, which would require the elections to be held by April 21st of this year, because the president's term ends on May 21st. And it doesn't look like it's going to be possible, at least according to what elections experts say, to meet that timeline. So we're coming up to a dangerous moment where the term of the president will constitutionally expire, and yet there's not going to be a mechanism in place, a clear legal mechanism to replace that. And there needs to be an arrangement worked out within the boundaries of the Constitution between the president and the parliament to make sure that there's not a political vacuum in Afghanistan, because that's something that none of us want. I think the second issue is obviously security around the country. It was a real concern in the 2004 and 2005 elections, and now it's much more of a concern. And the danger that certain communities could not vote as a result of insecurity and the insurgency threatens to validate the legitimacy of the entire election.
I think security is paramount. I had the privilege of being in Afghanistan in 2004 during the presidential elections, and it was an essential flawless event that day. It was amazing in terms of the turnout, very few, if any, incidents that occurred all throughout the country. But I think the challenge for Afghanistan is creating a secure environment so that people are free and safe to leave their homes to vote. So far, from everything we can tell, is that voter registration is going very well, and we're on track to holding elections.
Joan, from your interaction with the women judges in Afghanistan, what is your sense of how involved you think that women will be in this next election?
There's definite commitment on the part of women to make sure that the process works. The women themselves have been very active in a variety of ways, and they have taken leadership on encouraging other women to do so. I have not been directly involved in some of the electoral discussions per se, so I can speak more about what some of the women judges have been doing in different ways in terms of the Constitution and trying to encourage and teach other women, particularly the young women, about their rights and how to exercise those rights. And the women are extremely committed. You
both raised a point regarding the Constitution, which is obviously very important. It's the cornerstone of the legal system. And as we know, in the Afghan Constitution, it cannot contravene Islamic law. And there have been some tensions in the prior years with individuals who've been alleged to have committed crimes that were held to be un-Islamic, but may not have been against Afghan law. And I wonder if any of you have any thoughts on this tension.
Well, I think one of the most positive developments in this regard was that after the parliamentary elections, there was a new Supreme Court put into power. The previous Supreme Court, during the first few years of the transition, was abusing this provision and declaring all manner of things un-Islamic without regard to the Constitution or to Afghan law. I think that the new Supreme Court has been much more not only moderate, but has really engaged with both Islamic law and Afghan law to try and balance these things a little bit more clearly.
And Tim, I want to pick up with you as a fellow Afghan-American attorney, this concept of informal justice, which in Afghanistan, 80% of the population, have access to these informal mechanisms like the shura and the jirga. What do you think about development of rule of law in the rural areas?
This is certainly an area that we are focusing more and more attention on now. Alex's organization, the United States Institute of Peace, has a program there that's funded by the State Department. And the goal of this is to recognize that there is a non-state system there that has been in place for hundreds of years. And through the turmoil in Afghanistan, that system is what kept the rule of law and peace in Afghanistan. The approach we're taking is a dual-track approach. We are working to help stand up the formal justice system. But in the short term, we recognize that there is an informal structure in place, and we're looking at ways to link the informal system with the formal system. For instance, one of the areas we're exploring through the United States Institute of Peace is having judgments from the informal system recorded at a very minimum in the formal system. We're also looking at defining the jurisdiction of the informal system to disputes like family matters or property disputes, but taking out criminal matters where we feel that there is a significant potential for human rights abuses. What is essential is that whatever approach or strategy that is developed, it has to be Afghan-led and Afghan-driven. We cannot export our views or our thinking of how the two systems should coexist.
We've worked very closely with the Ministry of Justice in particular, the Afghan Supreme Court, and other institutions to develop a national policy, very much as Tim said, that recognizes and acknowledges the fact that most Afghans continue to use informal community-based mechanisms to resolve their problems. And in fact, with the exception of practices that may violate human rights abuses, those community mechanisms are not a negative thing. They're in many ways a positive thing. They help people to resolve disputes. They restore harmony within communities. They provide access to justice, often where formal justice institutions don't exist. One of the most important things I think to remember about Afghanistan, particularly over the last 30 years, but not exclusively, is that for the most part, Afghans live in a village environment, and that means that they have to deal with each other on a daily basis and they have to resolve their disputes themselves, whether it's the division of water, whose property is whose, how to deal with a marriage dispute, or something even more violent. And so over the centuries, Afghans have developed very important mechanisms to resolve those problems. Now, that's not to say that everything should be resolved at the community level, and we have to make sure that these practices do not violate human rights, but there's an enormous resource that exists at the community level to deal with justice and development and so on. And unless we empower Afghans to be part of the solution in that way from the grassroots level, this idea of creating a central government that's going to take care of everybody's problems is a century away.
The challenge for women, however, is that those informal sector and those local-based councils, etc., have always been male-dominated and run, and that for women, one of the big challenges is what is their participation and role in that, and are they getting the kind of justice even though those institutions exist? Where they have got in constitutionally, women have been given certain rights. In the informal sector, it has not translated in that way. So that's a big challenge still.
Great points. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion about corruption and the expectations of the international community in reforming Afghan institutions. Back with Alex Deer, Joan Winship, and Tim Nusraty. I want to talk more broadly about these successes and failures. If you can give some specific examples based on your work of what some of the successes have been in rule of law reform and maybe some of the failures.
The Afghan government recently ratified the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. This is important because it then triggers a number of steps that the Afghan government has to take to ensure compliance. For instance, they need to set up a civil service system that's based on merit, a transparent hiring process for government employees. They need to criminalize certain crimes like bribery and embezzlement. In addition, the Afghan government on its own conducted a very comprehensive sector-wide assessment of the root causes of corruption. And it's a 200-page document that Chief Justice Azimi of the Afghan Supreme Court led a commission that then developed into a strategy that the Afghan government, again, developed and put forth as their anti-corruption strategy. That then led to laws being passed by the Afghan parliament that have set up anti-corruption bodies. For instance, there's now a new anti-corruption unit in the Attorney General's office. This is a very specially vetted unit of prosecutors and investigators to pursue crimes like corruption. In addition, this new law has established anti-corruption tribunals in the court system. And finally, the president has called for the establishment of a high office for oversight that is placed in the palace that will oversee the implementation of the anti-corruption strategy.
If the officials who are running these institutions are the ones who are above the law, then how do we address it? Should the international community have a role to play when they're supporting those institutions?
Well, I think that this is a great point, because I think one of the key failings of our efforts in Afghanistan, whether it's from the Constitution on down to specific initiatives like what Tim described, has been a failure of implementation. A lot of the good ideas have been there, but I think from the perspective of the international community, for the first several years of our engagement in Afghanistan, we didn't provide sufficient resources. The international community was not well coordinated, and the Afghan institutions were fairly weak and also not well coordinated. And we missed a critical opportunity, not only to build capacity in Kabul, but I think critically to build capacity outside of Kabul. What you had in the wake of the collapse of the Taliban was a vacuum across the country, a security vacuum, a governance vacuum, and a rule of law vacuum. We missed the opportunity to push out quickly into the provinces where most Afghans live. 80% of Afghans are living in rural areas, not in Kabul, not in Kandahar, not in Mazar-i-Sharif. And it's important to reach those population centers, but we also need to reach beyond them. And the failure to do that, I think, unfortunately, has created space for others to come in. We're hearing now, for instance, about Taliban courts and the Taliban coming in, as they did in the 1990s, and saying, we are a law and order and a justice movement. I don't personally believe that most Afghans prefer the Taliban view of justice, but they prefer some type of justice to no justice at all. And this problem with impunity has sent a terrible message through the entire system that the Afghan government has not been strongly, and frankly the international community has not been strongly enough on the side of the ordinary Afghan, and instead has preferred to allow power brokers to continue doing what they're doing, even if it undermines the rule of law.
And Joan, with your work with the women judges, you were talking about the narcotics court. Mm-hmm. It is a difficult environment to apply a counter-narcotics law because of the dangers to the actual justices, even if they were to apply it. One
of the successes is that the sheer fact that there are about 70 women judges in the country. Most of them had been trained before the Taliban during the 80s and early 90s, and then of course had to leave the court during the Taliban period. But the sheer fact that Afghanistan has that many is more than exists in a number of other countries, even in the region, in terms of Islamic countries.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for coming on the show and sharing your views. I think we've discussed some very important topics for Afghanistan's development. And as you stated, we have to have security to have rule of law, but we have to have rule of law to have security. See you next week for another edition of Pull.